Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event, Tropical Modernisms, Brazil, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Part of our public program organized by Parasite in conjunction to our exhibition Garden of Six Seasons that is still running for a few more weeks. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce three wonderful colleagues who will speak in two parts of the evening that we will bring together towards the end in a conversation. So for the first part of the evening, a conversation between artist Ana Maria Tavares, who developed for the past decades a practice that critically investigates the different legacies and ghosts and traces of modernism and the conflicts between its ambitions and promises and realities of state. And an artist whose work is in very close dialogue to the exhibition we have currently at Parasite, and a dialogue that would have resulted in a deeper collaboration had this pandemic not stopped the internationalism that we were otherwise trying to maintain. Ana Maria will be in dialogue with Fabiola López-Durán, who is an art and architecture historian and a long-term collaborator of Ana Maria. And the two of them will speak about this collaborative practice, about the research and the curatorial work that they are doing together. After this first part, we will welcome Sean Anderson, who is a curator and writer. He's associate curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, at Museum of Modern Art in New York, who will focus on his research in the Sri Lankan lineage of tropical modernism, which together with the Brazilian one are two strong pillars of this internationalist moment. And he will visit that with by focusing on a few key figures, key actors, and key moments. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ana Maria and Fabiola to unmute themselves and to start.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening.
That's so funny that we have to coordinate when we are going to talk. I mean, we have been co-teaching, co-researching, co-curating for so long that we are not, right now we are even speaking at the same time. You don't need to mute yourself, Anna, but just to coordinate.
You know, I think it's better if I mute myself when you speak so it doesn't reverberate in a bad way for everyone. So hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. And we're really happy to have this meeting. Thank you, Cosmin, Enki, and Parasite. It's a pleasure to be here.
The same for me. What we are going to present today is a sort of dialogue that we are dividing into two different set of oppositions. Let me just share my screen. Can you see it? Somebody can tell me if you can see it. I don't.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's terrific. Okay. So maybe just to, Anna, maybe it will be good to say a little bit about the way that we have been working together. When I was finishing my PhD at MIT, Ana Maria was a visiting artist at the MIT Leeds Art Center. And I had the opportunity to learn about her work that was really, powerful to me, because I never had before the opportunity of seeing a work of art that was a sort of synthesis of the research that I was doing for my dissertation. So after that very important moment, I think that for both of us, we began a series of collaborations. So we had two first encounters, the first at MIT, then I was doing postdoctoral training at UC Berkeley, and I invited Ana Maria to join me there. Then I had a first archival immersion at her atelier in 2010. And then we organized seminars first here at Rice University in Houston, Texas, then in Vanderbilt, in Fortaleza, Brazil, Victoria, Brazil, Rio, and then in Brasilia, Belo Horizonte, Sao Paulo. And a series of exhibitions that started with a big project that maybe, Ana, do you want to say something about that project, Natura in Vitro?
Yes, Natura in Vitro was a collaborative project that I proposed to develop. I wanted to study the passage of Burle Marx in the northeast of Brazil, and had known that he was in Recife for a long time, but he also went to Fortaleza. And there were many traces of his work there, but not very much about it. And I also wanted to build a huge garden for Burle Marx with the artisans. So I set out this project and coordinated a huge collaborative work that lasted a year and ended up in a large exhibition at the museum. And we worked in collaboration with many institutions and artisans from different cities and different parts of this Fortaleza region. That was 2013.
Okay, so let's start. I'm going to start with a first statement about our first opposition. Let's see. So opposition 1, nature versus nurture. While nature and nurture have acquired a binary status, the work of Ana Maria Tavares seems to affirm that nature and artifice are one and the same. Tavares' fascination with modern architecture is really a fascination with modernism's maneuvers to reign in nature. If modernism commonly presents nature, culture, landscape, and architecture as totally discrete entities, Tavares' own background deconstructs those distinctions. As she said in an interview in 2011, quote, "I grew up in Belo Horizonte, a city literally designed as a laboratory at the end of the 19th century to become the capital of the state of Minas. In the early 1940s, the mayor Juscelino Kubitschek invited Oscar Niemeyer, Roberto Burle Marx, and other modernists to develop Pampulha, a modern neighborhood inside this modern city. It was a totally artificial development with an artificial pond, manicured gardens, and a marina built for mountain people who, ironically, don't have any idea what to do with water. My father moved the family there, and before I knew anything about art, I knew about Pampulha. Their landscape was nature, and nature was architecture," end quote. Here, Ana touches on the famous binary, nature versus nurture, first articulated in the work of Francis Galton, the same British scientist who will later coin the term eugenics to identify the biological and social movement that attempted nothing less than the improvement of the human race. Historically, we call nature that which is derived from genetics or inborn biological factors, while nurture is attributed to social, political, and cultural circumstances. Galton, however, look to people and pare down their value, seeing something raw, uncultivated, even plant-like in them, including their ability to reproduce, to perform labor-intensive tasks, and to activate their natural potential, equating people and land as if humans were not political subjects, but primary resources such as petroleum, zinc, or salt, or technical objects to be managed and exploited. Galton's primary of nature over nurture characterized the main line of the eugenics movement at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, eugenicists view evolution as impervious to the environment and driven solely by genetics, in which organic characteristics were fixed and were therefore impossible to modify by environmental factors. However, eugenics was neither uniform nor universal, and for eugenicists in the Latin world, organic characteristics could be modified by environmental factors, and these modifications could then be inherited by the following generations. This particular form of eugenics, activated in France during the Third Republic and eagerly adopted by Latin American elites at the beginning of the 20th century, became a dominant ideology of progress in Latin America and the very vehicle in the process of its materialization. This form of eugenics activated space and transformed architecture into its main technology and its ultimate form. So let me just go back to Ana Maria's work. I think that this was an important kind of conceptual framework for you to keep in mind. We are talking about Lamarckian eugenics, which is based on this idea that the environment is capable of changing human beings. So when I first met Ana Maria in 2008 at MIT, Ana Maria was preparing her vitrines, this series of works that you see in the screen, that were inspired by Lina Bo Bardi's museological elements for the Museum of Art in Sao Paulo. Ana Maria's vitrines, made of glass, stainless steel, and marble, were physically empty, except for the transparent photographic images of a virgin nature printed to their glass surfaces. In her vitrines, Ana seemed to capture the tropical jungle, its mountains and waterfalls, and with them, nature itself, the very threat to modernity. At that time, I was writing about the dramatic demolition of the Morro do Castelo in Rio de Janeiro, a populated mountain at the center of the city that, when totally razed in the early 1920s, displaced hundreds of undesirable inhabitants, supposedly for medical, but also aesthetic reasons. Ana Maria's vitrines, like clinical devices, like architecture, as I began to understand at that time, were instruments of anesthetizing nature, making it manageable. I realized I was in front of a work of art capable of being both a synthesis and an activation of the dichotomies of purity and contamination, nature and artifice, heredity and environment that were at the center of the eugenics movement in Latin America. But let me come back to the discourse of nature with a provocative sentence. Nature is always culture before it is nature. We have learned from contemporary historical studies that our view of the natural world is a form of social knowledge always historically constituted. The most serious modern travelers and naturalists, including von Humboldt, Charles Darwin, and Claude Lévi-Strauss, willfully accepted the idea of an utter difference inherent to and exhibited by tropical nature. And yet, this preconceived picture of tropical nature as difference, as antipode, was blind to political aesthetics and forming effects of culture. As Nancy Stepan, historian of medicine, writes, nature is not just natural, but it is created as natural by human desires and intentions. Recognizing that processes of nature do exist outside the sphere of culture, nonetheless, where we draw the lines between the so-called binaries, often that has more to do with the political than the scientific, expanding and limiting our engagement with the natural world. Thus, tropical nature, more than a geographical area, constitutes a place of radical otherness for the Western world. Other plants, other animals, other people, other diseases. Equating tropical with nature itself, the Euro-American world could then arrogantly see itself as the opposite, as culture. And this is very significant when you think about, Humboldt's writings about Latin America. He described Latin America as pure nature. And that has very, very important political implications. So he was writing for the Europeans, but that idea that Latin America had no culture, had no any form of civilization at that time was just a kind of like understanding of a territory as a land that could be exploited. And unfortunately, that idea was not only taken by the Europeans, by Latin Americans alike. So for many years, Ana Maria's work has been interrogating not only the modern project, but its embedded otherness. Her Victoria's Rillas, originally conceived in 2008, right, Anna? Yes, in 2008, for her exhibition in Japan, became the leitmotif of an extraordinary project for a public swimming pool in Porto Alegre. I think that this is my favorite of all projects by Ana Maria. Immersed in the contaminated waters of the Lago de Guaiba, Ana Maria imagined a pristine swimming pool with a glass pavilion at the center, which, like a water purifying apparatus, seems to treat the waters precisely through the encapsulated tropical species. Here, once again, Ana Maria recreated one of her primary methodological operations, what she calls a rotation, one in which architecture becomes part of nature and nature becomes part of the machine, its very technological mechanism of purification. In a sort of double clinical operation, literally cutting nature and inserting us within both the artwork and the lake, Ana Maria confronts us with the urgent need to recalibrate our relationship with the natural world. She transforms an aesthetic experience into a critical one. In other words, art into politics. So let me stop here to ask Ana Maria to elaborate on her primary methodological operation, what I just mentioned she calls rotation, and how it was instrumentalized in the specific case of the vitrines for Lina Bo Bardi, the work that initiated our collaboration in 2008. So Ana.
Okay, thank you, Fabiola. Well, before I go into the specificities about Lina Bo Bardi, let me briefly comment on the notion and practice of rotation, which is present in my work since the late 90s. You can move on. Rotation basically indicates a passage of one object or architectural element from one context into another to achieve a drastic change in meaning. By interrupting habit, the decontextualization of things and situations tend to suspend the experience of time, to disturb and to provoke a critical experience. In my work, the dislocated site-specific, for example, a concept based on the idea of rotation and developed in the late 90s, has allowed me to build up a series of critical approaches, both in relation to art and to the modernist project implemented in Brazil. The exhibitions Porto Pampulha in 1997 and Relaxo Visions in 1998 are a good example of this concept. So here, it's important, I'll describe the work and talk a little bit about the concepts I was dealing with. So first of all, rotation here for me was a very important strategy because rotation leads to suspension of time, a delay of time, and it leads to a critical thinking. Interrupting habit, interrupting the rush of time was one of the main ideas in this site. I appropriated the discursive contents of the site. This is Porto Pampulha. This is the museum. It was built as a casino, the original plan for Pampulha in Belo Horizonte. I turned the museum into a non-place, a place of passage, and called it Port Pampulha. The appropriation of this discursive content led me to create this disturbing situation where maybe we could go back one, where I implanted structures to hold the body from public spaces. So by muting these objects imported from public spaces where everyone knows how to deal and to handle and what to do with these pieces, this prosthesis of spaces. Once they are moved into the museum, they become muted and their functionality interrupted. So I was creating a place without a place, and this whole situation inside a museum looked like a still life. People didn't exactly know what to do and how to handle these objects, and were asking, where's the exhibition? Where's Ana Maria Tavares' work? And they were all sitting on these prostheses of space created for the Niemeyer building. I also appropriated the same elements, used the same elements as Niemeyer, glass, stainless steel, and created a situation where you really didn't know nothing was actually going on. The next step was to create a rotation, building up prostheses of spaces to inhabit Paulo Mendes da Rocha's architecture at MUBI. So what you see here in this picture is the Paulo Mendes da Rocha Museum, Sculpture Museum, where I made facsimiles of Niemeyer's elements from the casino, from the museum, and brought it into this huge underground space. There was no connection with nature, contrary to Niemeyer's space. And here what you see, it's an empty, almost like subway station with a sound piece created specially for this situation. So by rotating the elements from daily life, from public spaces into a museum, and then rotating these elements into another architecture that had nothing to do one with the other, created this kind of disturbing situation where the objects didn't speak for themselves. They were there, but it kind of froze action. And this kind of suspension of the certainties we have in real space and real life creates the possibility of a critical experience. Then one is led to think, what am I doing here? What is this? What is the status of this space? Who watches who? Also, the mirrors and the mirroring experience is for me very important, and it comes from Niemeyer by thinking that the usage of mirrors in Niemeyer becomes a synthesis of the utopias proposed by his this clinic architecture. Okay, so let's go to Lina Bo Bardi and emphasize what Fabiola has already stressed. The works vitrines for Lina Bo Bardi, from the Lost Landscape series, were inspired by Lina Bo Bardi's project for the museological displays designed for MASP. This is the MASP Museum, for those who don't know, this is in São Paulo, Brazil. Made between 2008 and 2014, it took me a long time to sort out the technical problems. They comprehend a set of 9 pieces made in glass, marble, and stainless steel, and UV print. Along with her well-known glass and concrete cavaletes, the easel-like displays made to hang paintings for the museum's collection, Lina also conceived transparent bases for sculptures to support art pieces made out of heavy materials. When I first saw the drawings for this project, my interpretation was that such structures were quasi-architecture. Adopting the shape of boxes placed horizontally and vertically on the museum's floor, they seem to contradict the visual condition of lightness and transparency of the chosen materials, plexiglass or glass, writes the architect. She goes further, improvising sketches with examples of usage by proposing something which seemed to me to be a radical provocation, to place on these bases, apparently fragile, the undeniable weight of bronze and stone sculptures. What really surprised me was the fact that, just like Brancusi, Lina subverted the traditional sculptor's logic, inverting the protagonism of the artwork to locate in the functional and supposedly neutral object the critical and the provocative aspect of one of art's most praised tasks. As in most of the highly speculative drawings, Lina interrogates about the materials and the technical viability of her ideas. She demonstrates the pleasure and the challenge inherent in each of her moves, from the choice of materials and the invention of techniques and processes going from popular culture to the most up-to-date construction technology. In this case, maybe due to difficulties shown in the project at the time or simply a lack of interest, there's no indication these vitrine bases for sculpture displays were ever built or even tested. After an imaginative process, a sequence of mental rotations, I accepted the technical challenges proposed by Lina in this project and invested in the possibility of creating a dialogue between Lina's work and mine. Instead of serving as plinths or support structure for artworks, as the pieces imagined by her indicate, my glass boxes internalized their functionality and became vitrines. They took on the dimensions and scale of our bodies and assumed the condition of the object subject of the scene. As aseptic capsules and empty bodies, they surprise us with both their puzzling constructive logic, which makes it almost impossible for the eyes to decipher, and with a virtual play that simulates the capture of nature itself. This virtual play results in the overlapping of the waterfalls and mountains, the images printed in each side of its transparent surfaces. Seen from various angles, they form a three-dimensional holographic field, which seem to be in constant fugue, a hollow space in three dimensions inhabited only by our imagination. What we see seem to move along with the movement of our eyes and our own body around the piece, but it is pure illusion. Nature is suspended, still, and frozen. Only our imagination can hear its sound, see its atmospheric changes, and imagine what we cannot anymore access, lost landscapes. In these vitrines, nature is imprisoned and made hostage. It is under control and presented for analysis and observation. The tropical jungle, the great threat to the modern project with its untamed waterfalls and mountains, float above a black and white gridded marble base. Like our vertebral column, stainless steel rods structure the scene. Without them, everything collapses. The desire is to encapsulate the biosphere and domesticate nature to finally comment on the perverse ideologies that nourished the modern project. who have witnessed unimaginable consequences from the strict hygienic and eugenic processes implemented by science, urbanism, and architecture in the tropics to the land and its people, though thought as contaminated, impure, and threatening to humankind. A project that is still in course and we cannot disseminate anymore.
Okay. So let's move to our second and final opposition. This one is between tomorrowness and otherness. So a pavilion by French architects Léon Josely and Albert Laprade for the 1931 International Exhibition of the colonies in Paris come together to help us to elaborate on this opposition. So designed to show the cultivating and refining influence of France's architects on colonial populations, the Palais de la Porte Dorée, then and now, is surrounded by a series of attenuated columns with Ionic capitals that both frame and cage the inner core of the building in a stark neoclassical style. The Palais facade reveals behind the columns that is visible from the street, a very important work of art that was carved by sculptor Alfred Janniot in a tapestry-inspired manner in which tells the story of conquest and empire through almost mythical depictions of tropical humans, animals, architecture, and plants. The so-called primitive others, figured as agrarian and mostly naked, were depicted with equally exotic plants, animals, and mythical figures in a scenes that decisively couple ornament with primitivism. Josely, Laprade, and Janniot were not alone in making this elision. It was being postulated that Adolf Loos' work equating ornament and crime offered the clearest understanding of Lamarckian theory at the time. Drawing a clear demarcation between colonized and the colonizers, the Palais de la Porte Dorée gave real form to the attempt to distinguish the conquered primitive races from the refined French populations. Subtle in tone, from a distance, Janniot's tapestry melded into a warm monochromatic surface, maintaining an appearance acceptable to Parisian society, who were willing to see the colonial other in a temporary exhibition, but less eager to tolerate the mark of exoticism on their fair city in perpetuity. So mirroring the still troubled integration of former colonial peoples into mainstream France, the Palais, which by the way is now housing the Museum of Immigration and an aquarium, give forms to the 19th and early 20th century resistance to see multiplicity and hybridity as anything other than contamination that so distinctly marks of the modern humanist couple from the post-humanist viewpoint. So Ana Maria Tavares' Desviantes from the social hieroglyphic series encapsulate the binary economies of primitivism and modernism through a visual essay on the origins of architecture and the tenets of modernism. Please try to follow me with this. So in this work, a digital reconstruction of Niemeyer's Oka is captured by the classical format of the horizontal window, covered by layers of stainless steel mosaic window panels. As in the Museum of the Colonies in Paris, in which the depiction of so-called primitive people and nature were architecturally disciplined by the order of the colonnade, here the Oka, which is a Portuguese translation for the word hut in Tupi Guarani, in its twisted, nightmarish apparition, is contained by two of modernism's primary structure, the grid and the horizontal window, which is one of Le Corbusier's 5 features of modern architecture, as we all know. So first, examining the grid, art historian Rosalind Cross described this geometric assembly as a 0 point, the absolute beginning, a fresh start, which collapses the spatiality of nature onto the bounded surface of a purely cultural object. So presumed by Krauss to represent a lack of hierarchy, center and narrative, and also a silencing, in Tavares Desviantes, it is clear that the grid more precisely contracts three-dimensional space and time into two-dimensional graphic ideal. The world, in its robust spatiality, is reduced to mere manipulable points of X and Y's. Second, echoing the cage-like structure by Josselin Laprade, which contains Geniot's exotic relief, Tavares Desviantes, embodying Le Corbusier's horizontal windows, reveal the historical and complex alliances between antiquity and modernism, between the origins of architecture and the modern strategy of the tabula rasa. Conventionally, a rectangular opening in the facade located at eye level frames the view and allows air and light to enter. But by contrast, Ana Maria's horizontal windows are blind and settled down to the floor as massive, weighty structures. Opaque, Tavares Desviantes allow no interpenetration between outside and inside. The worlds represented here are entirely interior, social construction of nature and its structure. As Marc-Antoine Loger argues in his famous 1753 essay Sur l'architecture, the hut as origins assumes a paradigmatic status for all architecture. If art in general imitated nature, then architecture might be demonstrated to imitate in its turn, not the outer appearance, but the inner procedures of nature, the cause and effects of physical sensation and need. One could say that Tavares' reconstruction of Niemeyer's hut is an image or an X-ray of its inner structure, its bones and tissues, almost a dissected anatomy. At the same time, there is a twisting and overlapping of the architectural space in the image, which critiques the clean rigidity of both the grid and the horizontal window space, and thereby modernism's disciplinary agenda. In contrast, for the exhibition Natural Natural in Fortaleza, Ana Maria recreated Burle Marx's roof garden for the Ministry of Health and Education in Rio de Janeiro, a garden that seems to interrogate from within one of the iconic emblems of modernism in Brazil, this building that was designed by Lúcio Costa in collaboration with Le Corbusier and built in 1936 on the very site where the Castello mountain once stood. That's the mountain that I said before was demolished for eugenic reasons. So like Burle Marx, Ana follows abstract patterns that seems to defy the very nature of the tropical, its exuberance, its lack of control, its resistance to human activities. However, Ana is not portraying a tropical garden, incredibly green and full of rare and colorful flora. In her almost monochromatic garden, alluding to the paradoxical effect of the extreme luminosity of the region of Seara, of Fortaleza, where she made this for the first time, that makes difficult vision, there is a representation of nature which is neither natural nor cultivated, and nature that has been turned into commodities. As Brazil took its own name from nature as commodity from his first product of exportation, the Pau Brazil, Ana's Gardens exhibits a catalog of species crafted in the most diverse materials, including silk, acrylic, cotton, wool, and leather, one of the main industries in that region. It is not a tropical garden of Western desires and nightmares. It is not colorful, but gray. It is not exotic, but domestic. It does not resist human activity, but absorb them. It is a crochet garden, one that requires collective human participation, one that becomes ornament itself, accessory, surplus, excellent, the other. So this opposition between tomorrow'sness and otherness is not different from other dichotomies, such as modernism and ornament, or the clinical and the tropical, both central to Ana Maria's investigations on Brazilian modernism. So Ana, would you like to share with all of us how your work works as dissimilar as Oscar Niemeyer's modern architecture and Roberto Burle Marx's modernist landscapes?
Yes, thank you, Fabiola. At the beginning, what drove me to interrogate modernist architecture was a great sense of failure I experienced as I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. The great modern country that I was led to believe to be ours was deceiving me in very sense. There were too many contradictions. The exuberance, the sensuous forms, and the beauty of the Clean and Clinic project, led by Oscar Niemeyer and Lúcio Costa, had something to hide. The idea of progress and the utopias were too far to reach. There was, of course, development, but along with too much exploitation, segregation, poverty, racism, exclusion. And Brasilia is still a study case. So my first careful analysis of Niemeyer's work made me realize we needed other voices to respond to what modernism had set out to promise. And it was only with Lina Bo Bardi and Burle Marx that I was able to find a way and understand the very problems we needed to address. With them, I was able to find answers. It was in 2014, with the exhibition Atlântica Moderna, Puros e Negros, that I put together a work that interrogated exactly the dissonant works, not only of Oscar Niemeyer and Lina Bo Bardi and Burle Marx, but also Adolf Loos and Le Corbusier. Atlântica Moderna, Puros e Negros is an installation conceived as a critical apparatus that aims to build itineraries and pauses, pervading nature and artifice in order to relativize the supposed threat of the tropical and the much desired asepsis and geometry of the modernist aesthetic. The set of artworks exhibited aimed at placing the visitor in the intersection between architecture, ideology, and modernity, revealing the way in which nature has been feared, romanticized, constructed, engineered, marketed, manipulated, and managed from the 18th century to our time, thus providing there with the necessary tools to explore our larger landscape. My recent works confront industrial techniques with handcraft, thus leading to the inclusion of the ornament, an element that was eliminated from modern architecture in order to interrogate gender, race, and otherness, themes commonly ignored in the more celebratory views of modernism. Therefore, tropical nature, represented either through the rereadings and translations of works by Burle Marx, the Victorias Regias, the Eurialia Amazonicas or of Brazil's hydrographic basins, along with architecture, present in the dialogues of my works through the thinking of modernist architects such as Adolf Loos, Le Corbusier, Oscar Niemeyer, and Lina Bo Bardi, have become the center of my investigation since the 90s. Dislocated into the Valley Museum, the ornament designed facade of Adolf Loos project for a house dedicated to Josephine Baker transformed the corridor-like pavilion into an architectural environment where the walls that organize bodies within the space warn us of the power of one body over another. In the home created by Loos for Baker, the front door welcomes the visitor voyeur into a small space with glass walls that opens into an aquarium-shaped interior, projected as a stage for the exhibition and performance of her Black, supposedly savage, non-domesticated, impure body. In the exhibition, the corridor ambient, transformed into large gardens, indicate ways of articulating bodies within architecture, and that which is implied in the Corridic dynamics, a history of social relations and locus of power, which connects interiority and modernity, a within in the within, a place where polite society could exercise its colonial dreams. In the exhibition, tattooed surfaces and functional objects mark the rhythmical pattern of acceleration and repose. Here, works are articulated to form a large garden inside a building. As part of the installation, Loos walls, so I titled the walls, the striped walls, as Loos walls, moves from this entrance of the exhibition site, covering the entire length of the walls. Loos walls traverses the installation where one can see display cases with crochet water lilies, a large woven rug titled Garden for Burle Marx, and empty vitrines for Lina Bo Bardi. Atlântica Moderna is a garden space that presents itself as an artificial landscape and responds to that which is seen as wild. Here, tropical nature, the great threat to the modern project, is encapsulated in lost landscapes for Lina Bo Bardi, or in the plexiglass vitrines for the Victorias Regias, works that embody a critical perspective via the collective work of women from the northeastern Brazil, and also in the Garden for Burle Marx, where the exuberance of tropical colors is eliminated, plants become ornaments and present themselves as shadow, as commodified nature. At the end of the large pavilion, Loos walls expands into a fictional video installation, transforming the wall planes into a new territory. An abysmal perspective which oscillates between distinctive artifice landscapes. However, in this video projection, which rebuilds Baker modernist cage house, she is absent, and is modern architecture itself, represented by a massive building titled Paradise from the Bunker series, The Island Man, that will sink and be engulfed by the tropical untamed nature. When I made Paradise from the Bunker series, The Island Man, in 2005, I was already making works which dealt with the relation between nature and artifice of modernity as a normatization process. The piece is a constructed landscape, a montage. So this is the work that is made into a video for the video installation, which starts with the stripes of the facade of Loos' house for Baker. And one enters the house through the windows. And instead of watching a swimming pool, this massive building expands itself in the screen. And it looks like we have another building, another perspective. And then it becomes the swimming pool. So the piece is a constructed landscape, a montage. The scene takes place in an architectural environment. Inside a room lays a horizontal steel and glass building. It overlooks the only grand opening in the background, which functions as a large screen-like panel, the only possible scape. From this large window of the room, one can see tropical landscape in black and white film stills from excerpts from the 30s, an idealized and ever lost landscape as a utopian paradise itself. In the foreground, a horizontal architecture, an organization and systematization of life, the isolation of the human being, one architecture inside another, the human being encapsulated. Real nature is a mirage or an overwhelming dream, inaccessible, transformed into a nightmare. This horizontal architecture is a bunker which allows the organization of the population. Here, paradise is inevitably associated with nature and utopia. The island man, the human being removed from his/her individuality as a social and political subject, and transformed into a territory, a land, a naturalized object. So what we see is the series of bunkers made into this horizontal architecture as a mechanism of control, normatization, and normalization, implemented mainly by the construction of the built environment. In my work, architecture, tropical nature, and modernism became the main subject of my explorations. In this piece in particular, I intended to explore how these mechanisms, which natural is equal to normal and artifice clearly function as nature, are at the center of the Brazilian modern project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for this very, very rich presentation. Really great. Thank you very much. And there's many questions, I think already, but I'd like to invite Sean first, and after that we can delve directly into the conversation. Thank you. Sean?
Thank you, Cosmin. Thank you, Ana Maria and Fabiola, for a really brilliant presentation. It's so lovely to be with all of you today, this morning and this evening, Hong Kong time. And thank you to Parasite and Anki for this kind invitation. I feel like so much of what you both have spoken about today is not only complicated, but also revealed in part by the presentation that I'm going to make. A little less formal, I have to admit. So, but I want to, in some sense, extend some of the language that you have both used in looking at Sri Lanka specifically, and the kind of chronology, but also the ideologies around nature and the notion of the tropical on the island and in the Indian subcontinent as well. So thank you very much, both of you. I hope to, I've been taking notes furiously, and so I hope to extend some of the work that you have proposed, and then in our conversation later, we can expand upon that. So I am going to share my screen now. Hopefully this will work.
It should work.
It should work, yes. All right. All okay?
Great.
Yeah? Okay, super. I chose this title. Actually, it is from the Austrian-American architect Richard Neutra in one of his last essays, when he's writing about how in his particular case, he had always been looking at the relationships between a constructed nature and that of nature, say, writ large as a kind of pure form. Yet the relationships between these two categories for him was not only visual, but also fundamentally bodily and physical. And in 1989, when he is writing about this series of essays called Nature Near, he is looking at the frameworks of a modernism, in particular a California modernism, as a framework for observing the very nature that he is, in a sense, trying to respond to and to, I don't want to use the word control, but to at least articulate more specifically. And just as a counterpoint, this is a set of, or a copse of Ficus elastica trees in the Peradeniya Gardens near where I lived in Sri Lanka in Kandy in the Central Highlands. And these trees are still there. This photograph was taken in 1894 by the photographer Richard Scowen. So I want to begin with a recentering for the moment. If the tropics, in a sense, is a band that wraps around the Earth, in 1989 as well, Brian Brace Taylor and Barbara Sansoni produced the first book showing the work of Sri Lankan architect Geoffrey Bawa. And the frontispiece of this book is actually a remaking of the world, of the map, centered on the island itself. And I've always loved this drawing because it not only recenters ideas around, say, global North and global South concepts, but it also kind of detaches the notion of the tropics as being this limiting and captured field of the planet that is burdened not only by latitude and longitude, but somehow it's bordered by these constructions as well. And so I want to begin with a quote by the art historian Ananda Kumar Swamy, and he is writing and responding to not only his long-term relationship with historical structures such as the Kovils of Jaffna and of Tamil Nadu in southern India, but then looking at historical forms more broadly and the relationships within them as a means to understand the kind of breaking apart of dichotomies that Fabiola has so elegantly presented today. So Kumaraswamy writes, if we leave out the modernist, individualistic philosophies of today and consider the greatest traditions of magnanimous art philosophers, it will be found that distinctions of East and West are comparable only to differences of dialect, while the essential spiritual language remains the same. And I was very interested in this idea that he is taking apart the kind of modernist dualisms that we are quite familiar with and thinking about the nature or the nurture of spiritual traditions within space. And in particular, these structures, for instance, in northern Sri Lanka from the 5th century BCE, many of which are now being destroyed in the wake of development, unfortunately. But to think about the Kovil, for instance, as an ancient form that allows not only hypervisibility, so one's path through and into the space, the sanctum sanctorum, the center of the Kovil, to meet, if you will, the image of the god or goddess, is one that also relates to one's experience of crossing thresholds in order to reach a more spiritual, if not direct bodily experience with the image. I would also liken then the construction of the Kovil and the mandap and all of these forms that you see in southern India as fundamentally like the screens about which Fabiola and Ana Maria were talking about. They are telling us something as we move through them. And a second kind of counterpoint then is the Sigiriya Fortress, which is a 5th century CE, so slightly later fortress, again in the central highlands of Sri Lanka, near Kandy, in which the Kashapa king at this time creates a water garden that surrounds this fortress that he builds on top of the hill that you see in the upper left. These water gardens are constructed at a moment when the landscape and the lands around the fortress are being re-engineered to allow for a number of agricultural systems, including rice, and that these water gardens still exist today, they still function today, and were highly engineering feats, I think, for not only controlling the landscape, but working with the landscape in order to effect a different notion of production, as it were. So I want to move then, jump forward several centuries and look at the kind of origins, for me at least, and the structures and systems for thinking about a tropical nature in Sri Lanka, one that is both a given as well as kind of unquestioned in many cases. And I want to look at the work of Lionel Wendt and the 43 group in particular as progenitors for thinking through then architecture, modern architecture, including that of Minnett Dasilva, Geoffrey Bawa, and others. So here is where I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll go back to making comments on the images. So here we are. So throughout the early and mid-20th century, prototypes for seeing were engaged by architects and artists in South Asia to inscribe critiques within shifting meanings of conflict. Apart from eschewing the dichotomies embedded within Sri Lanka's centuries-old colonial legacies, modern architecture on the island was a mechanism of asserting difference by articulating a convergence of viewpoints and their limits. The works that we will see today are suspended at the intersection of a multiplicity of thresholds, positioning landscape and structure, reason and knowledge. It is this limit of inframed ocularity and physicality in space that provokes contrasting readings. By observing a selection of both representations and architectural forms produced over many decades, not only by Bawa and his proteges, as well as the artworks of a few of the 43 group. What I'm going to talk about today is an awareness of continuities among these aesthetic domains that reinforce how a notion of the tropics and how a notion of nature rescripted approaches to the manifestation of post-colonial spaces. The production of a modern architecture in Sri Lanka and more broadly in South Asia conferred the potential of space with forms of materiality that were dynamic in meaning. Following the nation's independence from colonial rule in 1948, over 400 years of colonial rule, mind you, and its name change in 1971 from Ceylon to Sri Lanka, the capacity for geography's inherent architecture of structures informing movement and peripheries was complicated by the island's presence on the southern edge of the subcontinent. While the introduction of concrete and cement in the region at the beginning of the 20th century emboldened the rise of new industrial techniques and forms, Ceylon ostensibly did not initially embrace this material and its processes. Instead, what we see is witnessed in the artistic production of the 43 group and international architecture offices such as Edwards, Reed and Bragg, from which the architect Geoffrey Bawa emerged. We have a noticeable shift toward the ground, and not necessarily to say a restrictive notion of the ground and its international appropriations, but in a way, the ground can become, in this case, in Wendt's spectacular images, a ground that is both bodily, physical, the horizon, and so forth. And it's this particular reception of modernism, I argue, in Sri Lanka, that transforms the ways in which modern architecture is not only received, but perceived today. In other parts of the Indian subcontinent, the emergence of concrete and steel production incited a furthering of the colonial industrial landscape and a drive toward modern nation building. For Ceylon, by contrast, the appearance of these elements did not immediately find resolution in the visual and spatial hierarchies that we've been seeing not only in Wen's work, but as we will see shortly with Minnett Dasilva. The modern, rather, was international in scope, global, for instance, and local in formation. And it was demonstrated through the island's socio-cultural connectivities and found in the modern art practices of the period, including those of Lionel Wendt and others. So a modern Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, provided an assertion to a different form of building, social building, community building, modern building, if you will. Histories in and out of time, and also always acknowledging the nature that surrounded the individuals as an essential companion to an architecture that inevitably transcended scales and context. For one of the earliest descriptions of a syncretic paradigm for a modern architecture in Sri Lanka, and if not the tropics, architect Minnett Dasilva writes that the Karunaratna House in Kandy, seen here, was her first project. And she writes in the Marg magazine that this house was, quote, an attempt to synthesize indigenous traditions with an architecture designed for a contemporary Buddhist Sinhalese family and its way of living, using whatever materials and means were suitable, both modern and traditional, end quote, including these building materials that were found nearby. So she, in this house, is using a predominance of concrete, as well as you can see in these images I took in 2019. The house, unfortunately, is not in a very good state. It has always been on the edge of demolition, like many of her other structures. But she's using, for instance, glass block walls here, which were highly unusual and very expensive, to not only shape these interior spaces, but in the image on the right, you can see the timber floor. This is coconut timber, if not teak. And she's shaping the ways in which one perceives the landscape, the mountainous landscape beyond. So in a sense, Minnett is reclaiming a sense of locality, but using a modernist language that she gains from her not only intersection with, but her relations with people like Le Corbusier and the Siam Congress that were happening in the late 40s and early 50s. In the Asoka Amarsinga house, which I don't believe exists anymore, I'm not quite sure of that, but she's using this screen again that you see on the left, as well as in the far background, you see in the wall these triangle forms. These triangle forms are typically found in Buddhist Sinhala monastic structures, and they're often what contain candles and other votives. So it's these relationships that she's setting up with these interim or interstitial spaces in this house, as well as in this later house, another Amarasinghe house in Colombo. And from this perspective, foregrounding nature, but as well as making nature in the background as well. This house in particular also shows her use of reflective concrete or polished concrete that becomes a kind of standard ground, if you will, for modern and contemporary architecture throughout the island. And to my thinking, a reflective concrete floor suggests the kind of unlimited expansion of reflection that we saw also in Ana Maria's work. Just as an extension, I wanted to show another artist from the 43 group. Minnett Dasilva is not a member of the 43 group officially, but I would argue that her work is very much an extension of, and if not influenced by, the artists that were collectively gathering in Colombo at this time. The 43 group was predominantly an anti-colonial group of artists formed in the preceding years toward independence. And they were reconceiving their art production as a way of reflecting their political stance. So if we think of these images of Ivan Peiris and Lionel Wendt as political in some way, what we're seeing is this relationship between the body and the horizon, and thus nature and architecture in the midst of or complicated by these constructions. So an Ambalama, for instance, is an ancient pilgrimage space that you find throughout the island. These are conceived as shelters that as you are walking along trails, for instance, to get to a temple or to a shrine, you could rest there. They are temporary resting houses that are still present today. Similarly, I have to reflect upon the work of Bob McDougall and Bonnie McDougall. Bonnie was one of my favorite professors as an undergraduate, who is very much invested in Sri Lanka and measuring not only every object within this particular village that she studied with her husband, but then the forms that vernacular architecture took in the 1960s, at a moment when the politics of the island were very much shifting toward socialism and shifting toward self-sufficiency that became a kind of political and social means in the 1970s. Self-reliance became an imaging for the island, a political imaging in the 1970s. But I've always loved these drawings in which she has drawn every single object, every single pot, every single tool in this transparent way to locate not only the house, but how the house is occupied and imagined. And so I want to move ahead then to almost exactly the same time with Geoffrey Bawa's first commissioned work for the textile artist Ina de Silva and her husband Osmond. This is from 1962, it was finished. And this is a house on a very narrow lot in between two other buildings that was located in Colombo. And I will show you in a moment what has transpired in recent years. But to locate this house not only as an internal space in which nature is framed in this courtyard, and that one's occupation of that interior courtyard is then framed by the architecture. And to me, that this relationship, this blurring, if you will, between the dichotomy of nature and architecture, or inside and outside, these kind of modernist tropes, begins to signal, I think, for Bawa and his early work, all the way up to some of his last projects, not only a tension that he felt, but also a productive way or productive means for articulating an architecture that could speak across the world, across this space of the tropics, if you will. So here you see the interior courtyard. You see a millstone in the foreground. The courtyard is framed by timber columns. And then the private spaces of the house are both behind me and in front of me, or if you will, in this image. 3 years ago, because of overdevelopment in Colombo, this house was set for demolition. And very problematically, what do you do with a modernist work that is slated for demolition? In most of the world, these houses or buildings are destroyed, they're demolished. But it was a group of individuals working with the Lunaganga Trust, Geoffrey Bawa's trust that he set up while he was still alive, that began to work with the government to protect this house. And it was subsequently dismantled piece by piece. Every single stone, every single terracotta roof tile, every single aspect of this house was dismantled in an archaeological fashion and rebuilt in another part of the country on Geoffrey Bawa's, or near, I should say, Geoffrey Bawa's estate called Lunaganga. So in essence, this demolition and reconstruction allowed for a new perception of this house, which I think is extraordinary. The reconstruction, although arguably by preservationists, might not fit within the rules set out by UNESCO and other organizations. In fact, it did archaeologically begin to speak to how to preserve or how to rethink a modernist structure such as this one. So these are just two details here from the front door on your right, and then the roof system, the timber roof system that would allow for air to circulate in the house. And then two other views here of another interior courtyard. And then you can see the plan of the house from above in the upper left-hand corner. And then lastly, Hélène Binet was commissioned to make photographs of this house when it was still in Colombo in 2003. These lines of flight, if you will, that are inscribed on the ground plane here begin to talk about a kind of organizing of space, of bodies, of choreographies within the interior. A second house that Bawa starts to work on with the Danish architect Ulrik Plesner in 1964 was to speak to Fabiola's speaking of labor in particular. This was to be the Swiss headquarters of a major agricultural complex, farming complex in the dry zone of Sri Lanka. And it's called Polantalawa Estate. And here, these frameworks that I mentioned earlier that you can find in Jaffna, for instance, are presented here at the entryway. You see the entryway in the rear, and you walk through a set of boulders that are found on the site. And then what Plesner and Bawa do is create a roof system that covers these boulders. And then the interior of the house of this bungalow takes shape in and around these spaces. So you are always presented with and in contrast to nature, as it were. And so this is an image. The kitchen is to your right, and this was a little space for water that you see on the left. A third work from the same period, almost same decade at least, is another structure built by Bawa as the Steel Corporation headquarters. And in this particular project, he's using precast concrete, which wasn't, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't a common material, but because it was the Steel Corporation and because they were trying very hard to emblematize this new industrial technique for the nation, they asked him, in fact, to use both reinforced steel concrete and then this implemented system that you see here. And so he builds the main office building. This is the headquarters building, as well as a housing complex nearby around this tank, around this lake that you see. And this is the view from inside. And so I show these three structures, these three buildings, as an early, I say early attempts by Bawa to not only rethink the relationship of architecture to this present nature, but then also to structure the ways in which we experience and then see nature, both from that architecture and building or interior spaces, and then the exterior as well. By the 1970s, Bawa is now collaborating with a number of artists, including Minnett Dasilva, who would go on to work with him throughout his life and her life, as well as the artist, now controversial artist, I should say, Donald Friend. And Donald Friend comes to Sri Lanka, sees a number of these projects by Bawa, and invites him to Batu Jimbar in Bali to then build what would become another estate, only a portion of which was constructed. And that portion was this structure that was then expanded and renovated over time. But these early images by Friend himself, these are Donald's photographs of Bawa's interpretation of the Balinese structural forms, obviously then is both rooted in his own experience in Sri Lanka and thinking about Bali as well, what he's learned from Bali, if you will. And so you see the thatched and tile roof on the roof portion, the open pavilion at the top, and then the more enclosed pavilion below. And so this relationship between multiple grounds, I argue, is very much in keeping with this idea of removing oneself from the politics of the ground per se, and allowing one then to open up to a kind of new nature, if you will. Similarly, just to think about that negotiation with Polantalawa and a roof system, he's proposing around the same time these projects in Yala National Park in the southeast part of Sri Lanka, in which he's building houses in and around the boulders that are quite common there as well. By the late 80s, so the 70s are a great moment, a great decade for his architectural production, mainly domestic projects. What you see then by the 80s and early 80s and into the late 80s is again this return to a framework of architecture being both background and foreground to thinking about the world itself. In the Sharmini and Dhruvi Dasaram house, which was just renovated, what you see is a series of internal courtyards. This is the view from the dining area to a platform that was used by musicians, because both the Dasarams are classically trained musicians, and they always had music being performed or being played in and around these spaces. And just a view then from another courtyard into that courtyard, in which the visual and that tactility of the visual begins to manifest itself with these window frames. And so I wanted to not close necessarily with these images, but I wanted to think about more recent adaptations to Bawa's legacy. This is just one work by the great architect Amila Demel, who herself was working in Bawa's office during most of these decades. And for her own house in Colombo, she deploys these window structures that were found in an abandoned tea factory that then become an artifice of both roof and wall and window all at the same time. And this is both her dining room and living area, as well as the kitchen to the right. So in essence, Bawa's later years, including the works of the Kandalama Hotel, coming back full circle in my presentation to Dambulla, this is the entryway, no doubt influenced by, perhaps by Burle Marx and Niemeyer, if not Lucio Costa as well. So in 1992, he's commissioned to build a hotel on this rock outcropping. And rather than kind of demolishing the rock outcropping, he literally builds the hotel on it and around it. And so this is the entryway to the hotel, again, using highly reflective concrete floor to disappear, if you will, the boundaries that would construct both earth and sky. And in this drawing by Tim Beecher at the same time, what you see is the representation of nature blurring that of the building itself. And so this is a section of the hotel, and you can see that it is touching the landscape, but not necessarily built on or into the landscape. And in essence, when you go there today, the whole building has disappeared under vines and under growing plants and so forth. And it's with this project that Bawa then says that he hopes that the hotel in the future goes back to being the space for leopards and other animals to roam. And in fact, when you stay here quite often, you see monkeys and other animals working their way through the corridors of the hotel. So two of the last projects that I wanted to talk about is the Jayawardena House, or the House on Red Cliffs. This is Bawa's last project before he suffered a stroke and became incapacitated for a number of years. But this house on a rock outcropping is very emblematic, I think, to show the trajectory of those early works that I mentioned, in thinking then about his own relationship, this tension between an architecture that is open to the landscape in as much as part of the landscape or embedded within the landscape. So this drawing by Viersekera is then built here as, again, the very simple line in the landscape of the roof. And then the living area is completely open to this extraordinary view on all sides. And then on the left, what you're seeing is a short stairway down to a kitchen and sleeping area. So this opening up and this disclosure of space, interior and exterior, for Bawa then in his last project is quite extraordinary, quite exceptional. And so I wanted to close with just two images, two more abstract images, to think about one's passage through nature, in particular in Sri Lanka. These are the entry steps to his estate called Dunaganga that he worked on from 1948 until his passing in 2003. And what you're seeing here is the steps following the topography of the land around his house. And exactly opposite these stairs then are his working rice fields, rice paddies, that again reorganize the landscape in this very particular way. And so I'd like to present a kind of question, if you will, at the conclusion here, is that perhaps when we think of a tropical modernism in the case of Sri Lanka, we could also think about a monsoonal modernism. That tropical modernism speaks to a kind of, if you will, a universal, a geographic, whereas a monsoonal modernism suggests a more locatable, place-oriented orientation that is very specific to, in this case, Sri Lanka, given that it has two monsoons, one from the north and one from the south, and that the architecture and nature, in this case, are always negotiating these flows, these movements, and these systems as both productive and proactive in their world. So I'm going to close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. This was great and enriching, and I think a great dialogue between the two sections. So actually, I would like to ask all the three of you about how this architectural language contributed to the building of a sense of national identity. And there is a clear, there's on one hand a difference where in the case of Brazil, so many of these projects were government projects and were the most representative of government projects from building a capital and the edifices of power, whereas a lot of the projects, especially the ones that Sean presented in the Sri Lankan case, were more domestic. But nevertheless, there was a sense of a collective mission towards building the national identity. And I know a little bit of how, particularly in the field of textiles, there was actually like an almost government mandated or coordinated sense of a creation of a modern Sri Lankan textile language. So yeah, I wanted to ask all the three of you what you think about this.
Well, I'll start, Fabiola and Ana Maria. It's a really important kind of denotation, if you will, of the tropical being embedded within systems or political systems. If we look at, for instance, the Institute of Tropical Architecture, which was part of the Architectural Association in London, and a school and center from which many of the architects in this part of the world were trained, including Minette and Bawa to some degree. That school was governed in part by Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew. They were professors there, they were working there. And if you look at the legacy of their work, it was always in service of pre-independent nations and then fundamentally post-independent nations, especially in West Africa. So if we take the kind of pedagogical route and think of that embedded within a kind of post-colonial or kind of liberatory practice, I would say that there's no doubt that we can look at these architectural forms as emblematic representations of a politics that not only liberates the self, the individual, from the confines of an architecture, but also, I think in Sri Lanka's case, a material, a very specific kind of material practice. Through the 1960s and 1970s, there wasn't a use of concrete, for instance, because the political gambit was that they would be self-sufficient as a nation. So there was the government that banned the importation of materials to the island. And so that working with what they had, like Minette describes, is very much part of that same process. And I'll stop there and let Fabiola and Ana Maria speak. Sorry.
Thank you first, Sean, for your incredible presentation. I learned so much in this little time today. It's really incredible. I think that we need to really work in making all this work in the global South, in the economic South, more visible, right? Like I do believe that we will be doing a better job if we are taking the time to listen to each other, in particular to listen to people that has been working in all these parts of the world that has not been covered necessarily in our education, right? In the different institutions in the West. But saying that, go back to the question. So in the case of Brazil, and I'm going to talk as what I am, an architectural historian. In the 1920s and 30s, there were basically two events that, in my opinion, were key in the construction of an image of a modern nation. The first one was the exhibition in 1922 of the celebration of the oh my God, independence of Brazil, right? And that's the moment in which an entire series of neo-colonial pavilions were built in the esplanade that remained after the devastation of that big mountain that was inhabited. So that esplanade was filled immediately by neo-colonial pavilions and this kind of altar to a white Brazil, right? So neo-colonial was the style that actually Brazil assumed as the style to represent the country abroad. And that was mandatory until 1939. That was when in the World Fair exhibition in New York, historical styles were reserved for the organizers. And that's when Costa and Niemeyer produced this incredible, beautiful pavilion that then was kind of copied by Le Corbusier, and that you can see a kind of recreation of it at Harvard University, the Carpenter Center today. So, but that pavilion was a modernist building that was encapsulating a tropical garden. Let me go back to the 1922 exhibition. So in the 1922 exhibition, with all these incredible neo-colonial pavilions, they published a catalog that was a 500 pages catalog. And that catalog was really telling of the kind of image that they were constructing for themselves. So in that catalog, there was a sort of new alliance between beauty, health, and tropicality and modernization that the Brazilian elites adopted to represent themselves and their new nation. So it was this kind of beauty, a kind of like convergence of beauty, health, tropicality, and modernization. There was no mention whatsoever to anything besides one single mention to slavery. There is no mention to anything that has to do with the African Brazilian component or the indigenous component of Brazilian culture. And in all the publicity materials, you all see this like kind of Hellenistic figures. So they were like really portraying this also ideal in terms of human beings that was mostly Hellenistic, and they were always portrayed against these transplanted European looking hills and gardens that were framing like, you know, fabrics of, you know, like industries of shoes and all these different commodities. So it was very clear in that moment that nature became a very important element of representing modernization. It's the moment in which they also set the first stone for the construction of Christ the Redeemer on the top of the Corcovado mountain. That is the largest rainforest, human-made rainforest in the world, in the center of Rio de Janeiro. It was initially devastated by coffee plantations and then reforest. And it's the moment in which like the Pão de Açúcar became this monumental, so they were destroying a mountain that was inhabited by people that they didn't want to see in the center of the capital of the country, but they were monumentalizing another one that became this kind of source of pleasure, etc. So in the 1936, when they decided, no, they were literally taken to reimagine themselves in modernist, with modern architecture, tropical nature became a very important element that was expressed not only in the tropical garden that was surrounded by this pavilion, but also in the use of the brise-soleil, that was this kind of decorative, but also a climatic element, right? That was negotiating the local and the global. From that moment, tropical architecture was used in every single exhibition, from the big exhibition Brazil built at MoMA, you know, but like as a kind of company to the images of architecture, incredible architectural buildings, etc., to the different pavilions that were built to represent Brazil abroad from that moment on. But I'm sorry, I can't be talking about this thing forever. But I see that there was this new alliance between beauty, a beauty that was completely connected to being white, because they were convinced at that moment that the country was marching towards becoming a country with only white population, because they believe in white supremacy in a different way that in the United States. They believe that through miscegenation, the country was going to be transformed into a white country, and together with health and tropicality and modernization. So Ana, I don't know, you want to say, I'm sorry that I guess that I am talking too much.
No, that's great that you gave us this historical background, very important. From my point of view, what I think is that it starts as in a very intuitive way to understand the contradictions of this kind of identity, this modernist identity that was so important to understand ourselves. I mean, Brazil, I think that I grew up, for example, as Fabiola mentioned, when I mentioned about Pampulha, I said that because I grew up in Belo Horizonte and I saw this big project in Pampulha being, as the postcard of the city. And the idea of the construction of Brasilia that just followed the construction of Pampulha, and the capital, the changing of the capital from Rio to Brasilia was quite an important political move. And it projected Brazil internationally because of its architecture, because of this idea of this utopian Eldorado city. And there was a promise, there was a huge promise. And I have this sentence that is, this phrase that is, we have left, but we have not yet arrived. So this idea of an utopian country, a country of the future, the development, everything that surrounded us in my childhood and growing up as a teenager was about being in Brasilia, and Brazilians moving to Brasilia for a new life, and at the same time facing dictatorship. And for me, I was very uncomfortable the whole time with this idea of the elite and this amazing architecture for whom, and seeing the contradiction between the elite and the poor people, and what we were not able to accomplish. And I think it's very interesting because, of course, the majority of the Brazilian people really love Burle Marx, Oscar Niemeyer, and Brasilia, and it was very important for the development. But there were a lot of flaws and a lot of failure, starting with the people that went there to build the city and were put aside. There was no housing for these people. And so there was a lot of things that I started to realize that we had a facade, but the real problems and the real issues were not being dealt with. So it also, the construction of Brasilia also happens at the same time with Bossa Nova and a lot of cultural things happening that project Brazil to an international scene. And yes, it's a huge legacy and it's very important. There was development, but in a way that we were kind of blinding ourselves to celebrate this kind of identity and connecting ourselves to this great nation that we were supposed to be, and at the same time giving our back to the rest of Latin America and trying to become something else. So these contradictions were, for me, what nourished my inquiries and investigations about what was there that I could try to put together and create some kind of critical instance to offer as an experience in art. And I think that it is very important to think of this identity, that we kind of blind ourselves not to look at the other issues that are so important.
So just to take a little bit the question further and to basically take it to the present moment of like, what happened to that legacy in this moment? And particularly in the background of both the national crises that, well, have been so extreme in both cases, and Brazil is, well, has gone through several, but is now in a profound crisis now of the state and of its self-image. And Sri Lanka got through an even more catastrophic breakdown of a sense of self and of state with you know, one of the bloodiest civil wars in Asia of the last decades. Fought particularly around an idea of what the state should be and what its identity should be. So given the sort of like crisis that came after that utopian promise, and finding ourselves in the current moment with, you know, both states still in moments of crisis, and with a crisis of the internationalism as well, this language were somehow inscribed in. So what do we do now with that legacy? Where does it register on these thermometers of crises?
Well, I will just say a few words here to start. I think that we have yet to, in Brazil, for me at least, to recognize the failure. And modern architecture is still very much celebrated. It's very hard to see a full understanding of my work and the ideas I bring with the work, because there is a kind of rejection to touch on these subjects. So when I used Loos walls and I address Josephine Baker and the house that Loos projects for Baker, I'm trying to go back, way back, to trying to find where our racist attitude starts, and how we are able to live so many years and so long with slavery and this heritage. And we're not able to pay attention to where it comes from, or at least what was maintaining this kind of perception, and how much modern architecture and this idea of cleanness and its idea of minimal and cleaning, how this connects to our attitude, social attitude, by excluding people, by emphasizing and adhering to segregation and all kinds of problems. So I think that I try to use, it's very interesting for me to find that architecture gives me more answers and makes me make more questions than art itself. So for example, how can we I'll give you an example. When we had this biennial years ago, curated by Ivo Mesquita and Ana Cohen, they invited me to make educational project. And it was the empty biennial, the idea of stripping out bare this architecture. And it was a political act. It was very important. Ivo was trying to make a statement about the crisis the institution was going through. So when I arrived with my ideas, I said, look, we cannot think that we empty this building and we get rid of the crisis, because the crisis starts with this pavilion, this modernist, huge building that goes back to a lot of things and questions and ideologies that we have to discuss about. So my proposal was to make at the end of the huge floor, the second floor, a huge mirror wall that I call in my work Parede Niemeyer, or Niemeyer's wall, that I've been making protheses of Niemeyer's wall in every building to comment make a critical comment about the utopia, because for me, the mirror is a synthesis of the utopians in the modernist project, Niemeyer's project. And articulating a whole educational program based on Lina Bo Bardi's idea, based on her approach to people, to the land, to culture, to popular culture, and bringing that in as a structural, to structure the activities with the educational program. So this Niemeyer wall, the mirror wall, was supposed to work as a tympanus, I don't know how it's called, to listen to itself, to look to itself and question the ideas that were implemented by these kinds of buildings and this whole project. So this is what I wanted to say about this. Okay.
It's kind of difficult, but also I am full of hope. Actually, even though we are living one of the darkest moments, I think, in which we can see why history matters and how scenes right now are actually telling us so much about the beginning of the 20th century. I do believe that something is changing. So since I started working on eugenics and in connection to France, Brazil, and Argentina, when I was at MIT doing my, writing my dissertation, and I started talking about this, I had been facing, I cannot even tell you, exactly like Ana Maria, a lot of, you know, like every time that I'm talking about that, I wish I had recorded this, but like the reaction in the public, there was always somebody that was extremely irritated, either because I was saying something about Lucio Costa in terms of his racist position in his early time as an architect, or because I was showing how Le Corbusier's doctrines were based on his alliance to eugenics, and in particular to the thinking of a very important eugenicist, Alexis Carrel. I realized that there is a real, I mean, there is a big difficulty to deal with these kind of like heroes, right, that we have been building. Or they were Brazilians that were feeling completely upset that I was saying that about Brazil, because they felt like they, you know, that was not true, and that racism, there is no racism in Brazil, you know, it's a country that has been, you know, where there was no this binary racism like in the United States, but that doesn't mean that there is no racism. But more like lately, I had found less, but lately I'm talking after the summer, I had been encountering less resistance to this work. And I think that my collaboration with Ana Maria actually irritated even more people, right? Because this is like basically bringing the history of the early 20th century, the beginning of modernism in Brazil, into reflections that has to do with contemporary life right now. So I think that history matters is there. Theory matters. It really brings us into this kind of link between knowledge and action that we think we are called, is our duty to adopt, to assume. And I'm thinking that something is changing. So hopefully we will be able to start a different way of understanding the wonderful things that modernism brought, but also from a critical way of understanding also the dark side of modernism, and showing that the normalization of exclusion that modernism brought with itself cannot be normal.
I think that's a brilliant way of concluding what you were just saying, Fabiola. And I have to admit that for both Ana Maria and you, to irritate people means that you're actually doing something that is meaningful and worthwhile, because if we are a little blasé about certain aspects of our own histories and we don't come to terms with our own histories, we will just keep repeating them over and over again. I think to step back from that for just a moment and say that modernism, especially within architecture, as you rightly say, Ana Maria, is embedded within its rhetoric, in its values, in its processes, in its representations, is fundamentally about separation and about distinguishing a past from the present, or a past from the future. And we can't not look at representations, say, of the city of 3 million people, for instance, the Ville Contemporaine by Le Corbusier, and imagining the demolition of a huge swath of Paris to then put people in towers. And likewise, in the American context, that modernism was very much the mechanism through acts of demolition and quote unquote urban renewal or cleaning up cities and so forth. This rhetoric and these processes were instituted in the guise of a beneficent future, modern outlook to distinguish value, right? The value of property, the value of people, the value of space, and so forth. So, and if you then look at the colonial context, contexts, I should say, that modernism was always used as the mechanism for, again, delineating who is appropriate or who is modern and who isn't modern. And it was very it was very straightforward in that manner. Who could occupy modern architecture, for instance, in colonial Africa, and who couldn't? And so I think when we look at the context now, and I'm not as familiar with Brazil or South America as I should, my apologies, but in South Asia, of course, the kind of neoliberal turn has again repeated these techniques of demolition, of clearing out, to build skyscrapers and glass buildings that inevitably become bank accounts in the sky for the transfer of funds and monies and so forth. And they are decimating entire swaths of South Asian cities to allow for that to happen. And in Sri Lanka, that's happening in Colombo in particular. They've even started to build what's called the port city, which is on fake land, on land that has been taken up from the sea, from the ocean, to build more city. And so it's not only ecological disaster, but also one in which the architecture is being used as a symbol, a symbolic means of asserting power and asserting economic agency in spite of or because of the politics that are happening there.
I also wanted to bring up in the conversation a little bit another aspect that is found in many of these projects, which is that of leisure, because many of these projects were not just representative government buildings and images of power, but they were also sites of leisure, and in many cases that happened through they were acts of leisure in nature, enjoying nature in a way. And this is, of course, a very loaded equation. And there's a whole horizon of exoticizing that act that obviously predates modernism. So how does this, how do you feel about this perspective.
I'll just speak very briefly, because Sri Lanka became part of the tourism imaginary in the early 1960s, not only through graphics, but also this notion of a tropical paradise, this island that's in the Indian Ocean. And it's often repeated, even not only in Sri Lanka, but in many other places. Bawa in particular was commissioned to design the first major hotel, a beach hotel called Bentota Beach Hotel in the 1960s. And he collaborated with Minnett Dasilva on an extraordinary set of textile panels that you emerge from this rock cave basically into the lobby to see. And then you are presented with water and reflective water, ponds and trees, etc., before you even get to your room. And that's amazing building. I was going to include that image because it was recently restored. But that was for Sri Lanka the very first instance in which the construction of an architecture specific to a leisure class, specific to people who are coming for touring, was built. And it was, what's intriguing about that building too is that it's modeled in part on a kind of fortress. So you have this difference between a very heavy, very articulated stone base and then this very light timber structure above. And you're always negotiating those two levels. And then you are always presented with the horizon of the Indian Ocean in front of you. But what that spurred, that building and that notion of tourism, is now seen throughout the Indian Ocean realm, if you will, but also specific to Sri Lanka is the use of architecture specifically for tourism, and how to choreograph that experience from getting out of a car and going to your room to see the view or see the horizon was very much in keeping and still is to some degree today.
Well, I would like to say something also briefly about nature and pleasure in the case of Brazil. So if in the 1920s, natural monuments were released from, let's say, their tropical fatality, were politicized as the new icons of collective identity, and even moralized as elements of transformation that were directly linked to the reimagining of the body. And I'm referring, for instance, to these monuments that I mentioned before, such as Pão de Açúcar or Corcovado. There was this understanding immediately after by the French architect that was hired to develop the master plan for Rio de Janeiro, that tropicality, that natural landscape has to be tamed, modified in order to make it accessible for European tourism. So that's in his plan, and that was the way that they were understanding the esplanade that remained after the demolition of the Morro do Castelo, and then after the demolition of the Morro do Santo Antonio. The wonderful thing is that rather than doing all these like private condominiums or luxury condominiums or luxury hotels, they developed this incredible park by Roberto Burle Marx, right? That is maybe one of the most beautiful urban parks in the world. But nature was always this kind of source of pleasure, even from the Le Corbusier's ideas about Rio with these kind of elevated highways, residential buildings that were going to be separated from the ground and having these perfect frames of the magnificent of a landscape, of the tropical landscape in Rio. But in Brasilia, just going to what Ana Maria was saying before, I mean, the aesthetic pleasure of those incredible buildings designed by Niemeyer and with these gardens by Burle Marx, in my opinion, are incapable to overcome the tragedy that Brasilia is in terms of segregation, right? In terms of being one of the most segregated cities in the world, and a condition that is very difficult to imagine will change because of the protection that UNESCO is giving the Plan Piloto as cultural heritage. So what I'm saying here is that there has been this way of, this incredible connection between pleasure, leisure, and nature was instrumentalized by modern architecture into an element of enjoyment, but mostly for a particular segment of the population. There were some people like Burle Marx who basically were working in a completely different direction, and we had been having the opportunity of enjoying these incredible parks that were not supposed to be there originally. Ana, I don't know if you want to say something.
Yes, no, I think I'll catch on from the idea of pleasure that you brought, because I was just thinking when Cosmin said leisure, I immediately connected to this feeling of this great pleasure and the sensuousness of modernist architecture. And you were talking about it and how much it is really amazing. It's like, it's a big experience. But in my work, I have been dealing not only with these ideas at the same time that I propose a historical perspective, and the work is historically grounded and I bring in all these issues. I'm also looking at contemporary life. So I try to bring the history and try to find the origins of these problems by looking at what is happening now. So when I made Porto Pampulha, it was the beginning of a surveillance life. It was mid-90s, and all the cameras, the reflecting mirrors were all over. And I also, the internationalization of this public space language in terms of the usage of materials. I realized, for example, after traveling from the 90s to the 80s to the 90s, that all airports and all public places were using stainless steel. And stainless steel is the least contaminated material. It's used for food industry, for hospital, because it doesn't contaminate. And public spaces were transformed into indifferent spaces. One travels and one passes by and doesn't contaminate with the other. So the flow of the city is the flow for rapid transit. So I started to make works that commented also not only about architecture, but also on our condition, of life condition, and what was going on, that we became these persons, these people that are rushing through airports and subways. And all these objects did not connect or seem to care. So public spaces became spaces of indifference. So I started also to talk about indifference and juxtapose indifference to pleasure and talk about the pressures of contemporary life. I mean, we use credit card to guarantee a pleasure in the future that is going to come somehow. And I don't know how, but I have to co-opt with the system and use the passwords to go through life. So I have done works, especially using words and expressions. In fact, I made Ana Maria Tavares wall for Niemeyer, which is called Cityscape. It's a huge colored stainless steel wall that I implanted inside the pavilion, the biennial pavilion, overlooking the city, reflecting the city, letting the city contaminate this whole surface with the words relaxo visions, for example, lexotin, sundown, sunrise, and all the expressions that the tourism industry was using to force us, and also the economic language, you know, of being rich, or all kinds of passwords that guaranteed to everyone the idea of pleasure and of being in another world, a richer world, but all kinds of illusions. So what I think that is that I use the same kind of materials, the same kind of sensuous looking finish in the pieces to try to seduce and critique at the same time. So I think that the work embraces these ideas in different forms.
She is very perverse. Did you hear me, Anna?
Yes.
Well, I think we now realize this year that stainless steel actually is a good environment for viruses to survive longer than other surfaces. So I think that theory of sterility is well, disproved by pandemic reality. But before we open to the questions from the audience, I still want to ask Anna a question. Sort of in the spirit of well, internationalism, and in the spirit of connecting these different contexts, if, you know, getting familiar with Geoffrey Bawa in particular, if that brought you any different perspectives on Burle Marx and on, or more broadly, the sort of like narratives from a Sri Lankan context, if that's in any way useful for you in your own work on the Brazilian context?
Thank you, Cosmin. This is a great question, and I have the opportunity to thank Sean also, because I'm not at all familiar with Sri Lanka tropical modernism, and I was really struck by the idea that there's quite no opposition. On the contrary, it's so beautiful to see how things, it reminds me a lot of Manaus, for example, or the states up north, you know, where you see nature taking over and having this kind of organic dialogue and dance with the built environment. And of course, in a different way, they're trying to tame it. But it's very interesting to see this integration of spaces and nature. And the drawing you showed was really amazing. And I think it's very interesting to see. And I hope that now we have, of course, finally recognized the extreme importance of Lina Bo Bardi in our context, and Burle Marx. And I think it's very curious that we had to wait for an European woman to come to Brazil to recognize, to give value to cultural pop culture, sorry, and also Afro-Brazilian culture too. So I hope, and I think that we're more and more able to break this kind of dichotomy that we see in our history. And also one more comment is that because of our struggles with the politics and the recent events that have been occurring in our politics in Brazil, I think that Fabiola said she's very hopeful, and I think I am too, in terms of the consciousness that the minorities have gained and how much they're speaking out, and they're talking about issues, and they're very prepared. they have a lot of knowledge and they know what they're talking about. So I think we're going to have and to see, and I hope, a reversal. And then finally, we're going to be able to look at architecture from a different perspective. Of course, we don't want to destroy it, and I think that we have to value it, but with a critical view and try to see how we can overcome all these issues. And it's beautiful. Thank you, Sean. I really appreciate it. It was great.
Thank you.
I actually was supposed to come to Brazil earlier this year, and it was going to be my first visit of many, I would assume. So
oh, wow.
Just keep it on hold for now.
Welcome.
If you go to Brazil, then you cannot stop going to Brazil, believe me.
Well, I hope in the next years we don't know what's going to come.
Well, let's be optimistic. Well, I think we should open to the questions. We've certainly, extended our talk, but I think that's one of the silver linings of carrying this online and giving more space to the audience, and to the speakers, of course. I would suggest that because there are already quite a few very interesting questions written in the chat, but I would like to invite the ones who are posing them to ask them directly in the Zoom rather than me mediating them through reading. So the first question is of Benedicta. So I would invite Benedicta to ask, I think there are several questions, so.
Hi, everybody. So I have a very particular situation where I'm Latin America. I'm actually in Chicago now, but live in Asia and have been traveling consistently through Asia and Southeast Asia the past 3 years. I actually met Sean in Dhaka Art Summit, and I had the pleasure of hearing you. I cannot, with everything that you've said, one of my main questions was about basically architecture used as a language of dominance during the non-aligned movement. All of these architects were talking about, I was very interested with the work of Naim Mohayimin. Two meetings and a funeral, the 1973 Algeria non-aligned meeting, where actually when I was watching it, I don't know, Fabiola, if you know, there's an Oscar Niemeyer. I just posted a little bit of the video. And when I was watching it, it was like, is that Niemeyer? Like what? That video really opened a question about almost dictator porn. That video, it was a very interesting pose of what happened with all this ideology, all of these ideas of like getting rid of colonial power, but suddenly capitalism replacing colonial power and all these architectures being used. You've talked a lot about this, but I think because you did, I want to rephrase my question into when we visited Sean, we visited in Dhaka, we visited Louis Kahn building, which was amazing. It's is it the Supreme Court, correct? Someone in the group, this was people from all over the world of the art world, said there's others buildings like this in Bangladesh, and none of them are being taken care of or preserved as this one. And someone in the group said, why would Bangladesh spend their own money into preserving Western architecture when they have the needs? And that connects with what Fabiola was saying about Brasilia being declared cultural heritage. And that connects with what where it's happening today with monuments being, canceled in parks because so the question for you is, what is patrimony to a country like ours, like Latin American countries, or to Southeast Asian countries? Where do we put the worth in now? connected to, you know, like where what Fabiola was saying, yeah, I'm sorry, should we declare something of cultural heritage now? So, and my last question, but I think that might be private, is I would really like to talk about Mary Beth Edelson's work with you, Ana. I don't know if you're familiar with her gardens, but I'd love to connect with about that. But really, it's for a Latin American country, for a Southeast Asia country, how much do we preserve, or how much do we honor these places that were really allies to very perversive, you know, perverse movements in the end?
Well, thank you, Benedicta. It's great to see you now after a large space of time and distance. In fact, when we were in Dhaka, I came back only a few days before New York City shut down. So it's a really indelible memory to be around the National Parliament of Khan in Dhaka at that moment, with all of you, which was also extraordinary. I think what we are seeing today is not only a type of reckoning, but also a kind of reconciliation with what modern architecture means and what it not only does today, but what it did then, and what its function or form meant at the time of its construction. And indeed, in the Bangladesh example, there are numerous structures that could, of historical significance, that could be better supported and better maintained than that when in comparison to that of the parliament. And perhaps that then the answer to, or an answer to that question lies in what Cosmin asked about the nature of politics today and the significance of the political in generating an idea of what these buildings mean or symbolize, as the case may be. So much is linked in the Bangladeshi example to this project, to this extraordinary collaboration between Louis Khan and Masr al-Islam, who is the Bangladeshi architect who managed that project by and large, and then would go on to be a prolific producer of modern architecture throughout the country. I think in a way we are at a moment in which modern architecture has taken on the mantle of these histories, these narratives of not only oppression, like we were talking about, and separation and segregation. It's the renewed, how can I say, a renewed examination of very particular instances that these buildings now are embedded in these narratives of separation or of violence, right? And more broadly. I'm thinking of in Eritrea, where I spent quite a bit of time looking at modern architecture, Italian modern architecture now in a colonial context. But to Fabiola's point about the Musée du Colonie in Paris and so forth, these legacies, these afterlives are still all around us. These memories are still all around us, but it has taken social upheaval and social kind of recognition of these narratives to not only assert that these buildings represented a particular form of violence, but then ask, as you said, Benedicta, ask the questions necessary to understand them today within these contexts. So we are opening up the spectra of interpretation and meaning to these buildings, and simultaneously, hopefully, opening up the recognition that so many of the architects who were left out of this these particular moments will begin to kind of push against the hegemonic notion of modernism as being white or as pure, for instance.
Thank you, Benedicta, for your great questions. I will say that it's really shocking when you see that people don't make this connection very often between modernization and colonization, and it's just right there. So how we were able to invent different forms to continue doing the same, right? So where modernism and modernizing institutions take precedence over people, so development ended expelling the already physically marginalized people from the political run, right? And in the case of Brasilia, just 2 decades after its inauguration, the city that was conceived to host 500 residents actually ended up excluding 1.5 million inhabitants, or more than 2/3 of its population, right? So the tens of thousands of workers, the pioneers, as you know, they were called, who were imported from other regions to build Brasilia, they had no rights to the city, just to use Lefebvre and words, right, expression. So they were not to be among those who live, who will get to live in the supposedly democratized housing stock of the city that they built, not for them, right? So rather than becoming a social laboratory for the stratification, the Plan Piloto guarantee the preservation of the city's elitist configuration and its immunity from alteration. So like this incredible idea of the declaration of the city as a patrimony of the humanity, and that basically consolidating this immunity, right, from alteration. So I think that it's really interesting when we think in terms of the different strategies and mechanisms that were used in colonial times and were reproduced in modern times with the help of architecture and urban planning.
Are there other questions? Benedicta, you mentioned that you had another question, or that you wrapped it up here?
No, it's just I just wanted to add that I live in a country where there's a National Day for raffles, and we have a we are very proud of a very colonial, one of the 3 historical hotels in Southeast Asia called Raffles as well. So we still have a lot to go in terms of coming to terms with these subjects, I think. Thank you, both the 3 of you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Inti had several questions in the chat. You would like to ask them?
Well, they're not really questions. It's just the comments of joining the discussion. I wanted to congratulate and thank everyone. Yeah, it's a very important context that have been overlapped through these discussions. Yeah, and I mean, just to keep up the conversation, I was thinking that perhaps a building to bring into the debate is what happened with the white building in Cambodia, also modernist building that was originally built to house the rooms of athletes in grand project linked to some, I believe, a regional sports event. And eventually at some point in history, post-Khmer Rouge, the building was inhabited by informal living. So it was a kind of, you could say, favela, to put it that way. And it gained its own identity. Like it was taken over without the need to tear it down. In the suggestion, I guess, that Benedicta was implying on how maybe in the future modernist structures might be beheaded or taken down, like we're seeing with other styles of representation of power. But sadly, the White Building in Cambodia was demolished by the neoliberal interests of building what Sean was so smartly saying of the bank accounts in the sky, in the whole skyscraper narrative of contemporary architecture that we will have to live for some time now.
Inti, may I ask you, because, or all of you, would you tear down Auschwitz? Because that's something that we have to think of. These are also places we could be recontextualized and be places of memory as well.
I mean, it's a different discussion, I believe, because I mean, concentration camp and the trauma around it, visiting and creating some kind of memorial through its structure, it is an important ritual, while in the other cases it's with functional architecture, living architecture. Because
but it was still, yeah, but Brasilia was still systematic violence against a large group of large population. That's what I'm saying. Like, how can we see these places as well and instead of, you know, how couldn't we recontextualize them?
Yeah, I don't have a, maybe it's
sorry. No, it's for everybody. It's not only for Maybe
it's to allowing some entropy of another organic architecture to also coexist with it. Yeah, I don't have really an answer to that.
I think, Benedicta, in a way, the modernist paradigm of demolition, of destroying in order to kind of not only erase the memory and erase the site and begin again with a tabula rasa, perhaps needs to be rethought in the sense that Inti is saying, and rightly so, that that memory and entropy become hand in hand, and so that we have to, in some way, recognize that entropy, the entropy of modernist ideals, as represented by the, say, the dissolution of some of these structures, speaks more to our own perception and reception of these structures than if we were to keep preserving them as spotless, precise, white, for instance, buildings. So in a way, it's like, I love looking at images of the Villa Savoie before its last major rehabilitation, when it was kind of crumbling, because not for its ruinous state, but for what it signified. And the White Building in particular, when you, in Phnom Penh, when you look at it against Van Mullivan's Gray Building, right? These two almost opposing structures, but are formed within the same rationale, begins to talk about then a very specific moment in Cambodia's political history that then gets kind of transported elsewhere as soon as it kind of falls out of public consciousness. And those of you who are still sticking around in Hong Kong, I still remember seeing the so-called the Kowloon walled city, right? And the Kowloon walled city was again demolished to make way for new buildings because of its so-called unhygienic spaces. So these narratives are again about, I think, how we as societies and cultures begin to understand our own relationship to time, and how architecture inevitably is never permanent.
And it also takes us to a very important debate that we are having today in terms of monuments and the performativity of monuments and the need of contextualizing some of them, including architecture, right? So I think that we need to learn how to deal with this in a way that is informative, that deals with trauma, pain, and that does that by acknowledging it. It basically is pointing to different policies and a different life, right? So, I mean, doesn't matter if we are talking about Confederate monuments here in the United States or modern architecture in the Global South.
Good. So unless there are any other questions or comments, I think it would be time to wrap up. We went by 1 hour and 10 minutes over time. So thank you. And we're sorry about that, but I think it was an, naturally unfolding conversation. And I would like to thank the speakers very much for their wonderful presentation and insight into their work and their minds, and also for their generosity and engaging with each other and with the questions and with us. So big thank you to everyone. And
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was really great.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I hope we will have other opportunities to talk. I really am fascinated. I think that I need to invite you, Sean, just to have something that we can, where we can talk about. Yeah, let's do something, Ana, because I think that it's really one thing.
We all have to go to Kathmandu to see the triennial when it opens next year. Yes.
Say it again. I couldn't hear. Sorry, Sean.
No worries. I said we all have to go to Cosmin's Kathmandu triennial.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Next year, yes.
I know, yes.
It will be in October at a date to be announced soon. So when hopefully the borders will be opening in one way or another.
It's next year.
Next year, yes, we pushed it.
Okay.
So, yes, hopefully to a brighter future.
All right. Thank you very much. It's great to be together in spite of, all the conditions we have faced today, and we're locked in again, I guess, around here in Europe, starting to close down, but let's hope for a better time. And it's great to be able to join so many people. I saw was really large group, no? Up
yes,
until
it is.
Now.
Yeah. We had a big group, and I'm sure that the video we're going to upload it on our channels and will be watched by actually way more people later on.
Great.
So it's usually
fantastic.
So yeah,
okay.
Big thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Anki.
Thank you.
And goodbye. Yes.
Obrigado, Ana Maria.
Thank you so much, guys.
Merci. Obrigado. Bye-bye. Thank you.